He found a frozen ship in the river and thought it was a chance to start over. But inside was a secret room that the Mafia had been trying to hide for decades. And a few days later, his daughters disappeared. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Andrew Hartman had forgotten what silence sounded like until that winter. True silence, the kind that presses into your ears and weighs on your chest, the kind that belongs to empty houses and frozen landscapes and men who have lost too much. For a long time after his wife's accident, he had lived inside a muffled world where every sound seemed distant, as if wrapped in wool. The laughter of his daughters no longer echoed the way it once had. His tools, once comforting in their rhythm, now felt like reminders of where his life should have been, but wasn't. Work came in fits and starts. Clients pitied him, some avoided him, and he avoided them back. He did what he had to for Haley and Marley, but every decision felt like lifting a stone uphill. He tried to keep the girls smiling, tried to stay patient when nightmares woke them, and tried not to crumble when they asked when Mommy was coming home. But grief had a way of turning every room into a mausoleum. The house where they lived, once warm and filled with the sound of music and cooking and the everyday chaos of family life, had become cold even when the heater groaned through the nights. Everywhere he looked, he saw traces of his wife, her scarves on the hooks by the door, her handwriting on notes tucked into cookbooks, her perfume still faint in the closet. He caught himself avoiding certain rooms, certain corners, certain memories that rose up like ghosts. So when he saw the faded advertisement pinned crookedly to the bulletin board of the grocery store, "Old river vessel for sale, $50. Must remove yourself." He had stared at it longer than he meant to. At first it had been absurd, almost laughable. He wasn't a sailor, didn't know the first thing about water beyond the carpentry occasionally involved in fixing docks. But the idea clung to him, tugging like a thread. Maybe because it was strange. Maybe because it was cheap. Maybe because it wasn't the house he'd shared with his wife. Maybe because it was something he could rebuild from the foundation up. Something that didn't hold memories he wasn't ready to face. The cashier saw him hesitate and snorted softly. "Nobody wants that thing," she said, without looking up from scanning cans. "Mafia owned it back in the 90s. People say it's cursed, or haunted, or just plain unlucky. I'd stay away from it if I were you." But Andrew wasn't superstitious, and haunted was just another word for abandoned. Ghosts were only memories people refused to let go of. He tore off one of the little paper tabs with the owner's number and stuffed it into his pocket. A week later, on a cold, gray morning, he packed his daughters into the truck and drove toward the coordinates the owner had sent him. The road narrowed as they moved deeper into the forest. Branches arched above like ribs. The sky had turned white with winter, and the frost on the pines thickened until it looked like the whole forest had been carved from ice. Haley and Marley watched through the windows with wide eyes, drawing little shapes into the fogged glass. "Are we going to see a real ship, Daddy?" Marley asked from the back seat, her voice hopeful. "If the man on the phone was telling the truth," Andrew said, "we'll find out soon." "And it's really only $50? Haley stretched to peer out the front window. "Why so cheap?" "Because nobody else wants it," he answered honestly. The road finally ended in a clearing, where the river should have been wide and flowing. Instead, winter had frozen everything into a pale, glistening mirror. A thin sheet of fog drifted over the surface of the ice like breath. For a moment there was nothing to see, only trees and white silence. Then, as the fog shifted, something vast began to emerge. The ship looked as though it had risen from the riverbed itself. Its hull was streaked with rust, its once white paint eaten down to metal. It leaned slightly to one side, trapped in the frozen water, as if winter had caught it mid-escape. Tall trees pressed close from the bank, their branches touching its railing, giving it the eerie appearance of a forgotten house swallowed by the forest. The fog curled around its bow, and for a moment it resembled the prow of a ghostly creature turning its head toward them. The ship was enormous, larger than Andrew expected. 2 full decks, a wheelhouse on top, shattered windows, sagging railings, and a darkness in its corridors that looked thick enough to swallow a man whole. The girls gasped. "Daddy," Haley whispered, "it looks like something from a storybook." "It looks like it's dead," Marley added, but with fascination, not fear. Andrew stepped out of the truck, boots crunching the snow, his breath clouding in the frigid air. The ship dwarfed everything around it. It was a relic, a beast, a monument to an era long gone. And yet something about it stirred a feeling in him he hadn't felt in months, a faint spark of purpose. They crossed the patchy snow to the frozen river, the surface creaking under their weight as they moved toward the ship. A plank of wood led from the ice up to the lowest deck, something the seller must have placed for visits. It wobbled beneath their feet as they climbed. The first step onto the deck felt like stepping into another life. The boards were soft in places, stiff in others, and the metal supports groaned with age. The silence was different up here, heavier, as if the ship was listening. Inside, the air grew colder. They walked through narrow halls lined with peeling wallpaper, the faded pattern barely visible. The fluorescent lights had long since died, leaving only the weak gray light that spilled through shattered portholes. Every sound echoed, their footsteps, the soft brush of coats, the wind moaning against the hull. Bullet holes marked the walls in clusters. Edges of the metal were rippled, scorched in places. In one corridor, Haley froze, pointing at a dark stain on the floor. "Daddy, is that blood?" "Old paint," he said automatically, though he wasn't entirely sure. They reached the upper deck, where a larger room opened like the center of a home. A table lay overturned, chairs scattered. A cracked mirror sagged from one wall. Empty whiskey bottles rolled across the floor, as if disturbed recently, though the cold suggested otherwise. "Look," Haley said softly, kneeling beside a narrow gap in the paneling. She reached into the darkness and pulled out a curled photograph. 3 men sat around a polished wooden table, all in expensive suits, cigars smoking in their hands. Behind them, on the ship's wall, hung a framed insignia 3 intersecting lines. On the back was a scribbled note. "Last deal. 92. Andrew felt the temperature drop even further. The cashier at the store had been right. This ship once belonged to the Lucarelli family, one of the most feared Mafia clans along the East Coast. Their crimes were the kind that made the news only when bodies washed ashore or when someone high-ranking disappeared. The Lucarellis had been ghosts long before the ship became one. He turned the photograph over again, studying the faces, the sharp eyes, the smirks that belonged to men who believed they owned the world. Why had they met here? Why had the ship ended up abandoned in this ice-bound river? Why had no one reclaimed it? "Daddy?" Marley tugged his sleeve. "Someone's knocking." "Knocking?" he repeated. She pointed downward. They all listened. There it was, bond, muffled, rhythmic. A low thud against the metal hull, like knuckles tapping from beneath the frozen waterline. 1, 2, pause. 1, 2, 3. "It's just the ice shifting," he told her, though the sound felt too deliberate, too alive. The wheelhouse drew him like a magnet. Inside, the air was oddly different, less stale, as if someone had been there not long ago. A faint smell of tobacco lingered, the ghost of fragrant smoke woven into the air. On the captain's desk sat a logbook. The pages were wrinkled with age, the ink smudged from moisture, but one final entry at the bottom stood out, written with a trembling hand. "If we reach the shore, we are doomed. If we sink, we are saved. God forgive us for what we have carried." Andrew stared at the words, reading them twice, then a third time. They made no sense, yet carried the weight of something unspeakable. He looked around the wheelhouse again, noticing small things he had missed at first glance. A coat left draped over a hook, a cracked glass still half full of amber liquid, a map of the river with certain bends circled in red. Someone had left in a hurry, or someone had never left at all. "Daddy," Haley called from outside. "You have to see the view." He stepped out, forcing a smile, pushing the unease deep down. From the upper railing, the frozen river stretched endlessly, white and glistening. The fog drifted lazily, almost graceful in its movement. The forest surrounding them seemed to stand guard, ancient and watchful. It should have felt peaceful, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was watching too. Someone who belonged to this ship long before he had ever set foot on it. The girls were smiling, cheeks flushed from the cold, their eyes bright. The first genuine happiness he'd seen in months. For them, this place was magic. A floating castle, a secret fortress. They were already picking out imaginary bedrooms, pointing at doors and planning adventures. He saw the spark of hope in their faces, and it pierced him deeply. He hadn't planned to buy a ship. He certainly hadn't planned to rebuild one. But something in him shifted as he watched his daughters run across the deck, their boots leaving prints in the thin dusting of frost. Maybe this was what they needed. Maybe this was what he needed. A project that would demand his hands, his time, his thoughts. Something untouched by grief. When the seller arrived, an indifferent man in a heavy coat who barely looked at the vessel. Andrew signed the paperwork with a strange sense of gravity. $50 exchanged hands, though the seller would probably have given it away for nothing. By the time evening fell, the girls were yawning, huddled close to him as he locked the truck. They didn't want to leave, but agreed they would return in the morning. As Andrew took one last look at the ship, its silhouette rising from the frozen river like a sleeping giant, a cluster of shadows shifted at the tree line. He blinked, thinking it was just the play of fog and branches. But the hairs on his arms prickled, as if something, was observing them from the dark, silent forest. He told himself it was nothing. Yet as the truck rumbled away down the icy road, the sound of tapping echoed across the river again. 3 knocks, slow and patient, as though answering a question no one had asked. The ship remained still, frozen in place, but the forest seemed to lean in closer, listening. And in that moment, Andrew felt it for the first time. The ship wasn't empty. It was waiting. Morning came pale and cold, with a thin film of frost creeping across the truck's windshield like a second skin. Andrew woke earlier than he intended, the memory of the ship tugging at him even in sleep. He lay still for a moment, listening to the soft breaths of his daughters in the back seat. The heater had long since cooled, and the air inside the truck felt sharp in his lungs. Yet something about the cold steadied him. The strange, heavy stillness from the night before had not left. It clung to him, as if he had brought a piece of the ship's silence with him when they drove away. The girls stirred awake, rubbing their eyes, and asking immediately when they could go back. It surprised him how eager they were. Children had a way of seeing wonder in places adults saw only ruin. He started the engine, and the truck protested with a growl before settling. The drive back to the river felt shorter, maybe because he was less afraid of what he might find. Or maybe because he was more afraid of doing nothing and letting their lives remain stuck in the same place, with grief filling every inch of their home. As they arrived at the clearing, the fog lifted lazily from the river, exposing the ship like a great rusted skeleton trapped in winter. The sight no longer startled him. It felt strangely familiar now, like rediscovering a distant relative whose existence he had forgotten. He helped the girls onto the makeshift plank and followed them across the ice, listening to the small cracks beneath them. Inside, their voices filled the corridors again, bouncing off the walls in a way that breathed life back into the place. Andrew walked through the ship with a different eye now, not as a visitor, but as a builder. He began to imagine what could be repaired, what could be torn out, what could become a room or a living space. The idea was ludicrous, maybe even impossible, but the thought alone brought a clarity he hadn't felt in months. He had always measured his worth through building, creating, restoring. Maybe the ship was more than debris from some forgotten crime. Maybe it was a foundation. He started by clearing the main deck with the girls. They dragged broken chairs into piles, swept out the leaves and frost that had collected, and opened windows to let in what little light filtered through the gray sky. Haley found a broom and swung it like a sword, declaring herself captain, and Marley followed, insisting she would be the first mate. Their laughter shook loose the dust in the air and sent it swirling like tiny spirits, rising from the wooden planks. It wasn't until their feet thudded across the forward hall that Andrew noticed the faint pattern in the floorboards, a long, narrow seam that didn't match the rest of the structure. He crouched, running his fingers across the cold metal. The line was too straight, too intentional. This wasn't a gap from age. It was a door, welded shut with thick, clumsy lines of metal that caught the light in uneven ridges. Whoever had closed it hadn't wanted it opened again. "That's a door," Haley whispered, kneeling beside him. "Isn't it?" "A hatch," he corrected quietly. "A hidden one." Marley leaned closer, squinting at the faint marking near the corner of the seam. 3 intersecting lines scratched deep into the metal, overlapping like ancient runes. "What does that mean?" she asked. "I don't know," Andrew said, though he did know enough to feel uneasy. The symbol was the same as the one in the photograph, the emblem of the Lucarelli family. This wasn't an accident. Someone had sealed whatever lay beneath for a reason. He straightened slowly, scanning the dim corridor. For a moment he imagined footsteps behind them, a shadow lingering at the end of the hall. But when he turned, everything was still. The girls moved on, but Andrew stayed behind, his mind circling around the welded hatch. It called to him, as if the metal itself held a breath waiting to be released. He didn't open it then, but he made a silent promise to return when the girls weren't nearby. He spent the next hours clearing debris, patching drips in the ceiling, imagining where he could install insulation. The cold gnawed deep into the ship's bones, but he could fix that. He would fix it, room by room. He had no idea how long the river would remain frozen, but he would work until it thawed. And after, if he had to. Later, after a quick lunch eaten sitting on a sagging bench, he made his way to the wheelhouse to take measurements. The map was still there on the desk, the red circles marking different points along the river. Some were accompanied by scribbled notes he could barely decipher. One word stood out: drop. Another said, transfer. A third simply read, no return. He found a small safe bolted into the floor beneath the captain's desk. It was old, its lock warped, one hinge bent out of shape. He tapped it with his knuckles and felt the hollow reverberation. Something was inside. He hesitated. Breaking into it felt wrong, like treading into the private world of men who had died violently or vanished mysteriously. But the ship was his now, and the secrets in it were tangled with his daughter's safety. He grabbed a wrench from his toolbox and began working the bolts loose. It took nearly an hour, his fingers numb from the cold, but finally the hinge gave way, and the door dropped open with a jarring clang. Inside were folders stacked neatly, wrapped in a plastic sheet. He pulled them out carefully. The paper crackled at his touch. The documents were lists, names, dates, transactions. His eyes widened as he recognized a few of the names. Politicians, 2 local law enforcement officers who had since retired, and a federal agent whose disappearance had made national headlines decades earlier. There were coded maps, numbers, and annotations in a hurried hand. The date on the last page was July 14th, 1992, the night the ship had vanished from the river's records and into legend. A chill crept over him that had nothing to do with the cold. This ship wasn't just a relic, it was evidence. Maybe evidence someone didn't want found. He placed the papers back into the safe, closed it gently, and tried to steady his breathing. He didn't want the girls to see any of this yet, not until he understood what it meant. That evening, as the light faded and they prepared to leave, Andrew noticed something new in the clearing where they had parked that morning. Tire tracks, fresh ones. The snow had been undisturbed when they arrived, but now 2 parallel lines curved toward the trees, then back out. Someone had come here while they were inside, perhaps a hunter, perhaps someone drawn by curiosity, perhaps something worse. When they returned the next morning, the girls ran ahead, racing toward the ship, but Andrew stopped short halfway across the clearing. On the trunk of a pine near the riverbank, deep in the bark, was a freshly carved symbol, 3 sharp intersecting lines. The same as the hatch, the same as the photograph. He touched the grooves lightly. The wood was raw beneath the cut, fresh enough that sap still glistened in the cold air. Someone had done this yesterday. Someone who wanted him to see it. He told the girls nothing, not wanting to frighten them, but he felt the eyes of the forest on them as they climbed the plank. The ship no longer felt like just an abandoned vessel. It felt watched. Inside, he set the girls to organizing their rooms, small cabins with rusted frames and damaged flooring. They decorated with blankets they had brought, imagining curtains and paintings and flower pots. Their innocence softened the bleakness of the interior, and for a short while their chatter drowned out the unease. He used that time to return to the hidden hatch. With the girls occupied and out of sight, he examined the welded seam with more focus. The metal had been sealed in haste, the weld marks jagged and uneven. Whoever closed it had done so urgently, perhaps in fear. This only made Andrew more determined. He fetched his portable grinder and safety goggles. As he plugged in the tool, he paused, listening. The ship's silence pressed in on him again, dense and suffocating. He flicked the switch, and the grinder roared to life, sparks flying as he cut through the seam. The smell of burnt metal filled the corridor. It took longer than he expected, but eventually the door gave a loud metallic groan and fell inward, crashing onto a lower surface with an echo that resonated throughout the ship. He shone his flashlight into the darkness below. A narrow ladder descended into a chamber that seemed larger than the upper decks. He climbed down cautiously, boots landing on cold steel. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of oil and decay. His light fell upon a massive rectangular object dominating the center of the room, a steel container, thick as a bank vault. Thick dents marred its sides, as if something had struck it repeatedly from within. The symbol of the Lucarelli family was etched onto the metal, deep enough to leave grooves. He approached slowly, a knot forming in his stomach. There was a latch, rusted but intact. He wiped a layer of dust off and noticed something handwritten on the side in fading paint. Family Archive. Do not open. His pulse quickened. He hesitated, then opened the latch. The door hissed as stale air rushed out. Inside, stacks of binders, folders, and sealed envelopes filled the container. Old cassette tapes sat in a box. A camera with a broken lens lay atop the files. He pulled out the top binder. It contained more names, nearly 200 people listed as missing or presumed dead. There were photos of crime scenes, diagrams of financial schemes, records of bribes and extortion. He realized he was holding decades' worth of evidence capable of dismantling multiple crime families and possibly exposing government corruption. He felt dizzy. No wonder the ship had been sealed and abandoned. This archive was a death sentence for anyone who possessed it. As he stood there, absorbing the enormity of what he'd found, a loud thud echoed from above. He froze, listening. Another thud. Then a series of soft creaks. Footsteps. Someone was on the deck. He extinguished the flashlight, climbed the ladder silently, and peeked into the hallway. The lights from outside cast faint shadows into the ship, creating the illusion of movement where there was none. But then he heard it, a soft crunch, like someone stepping on frost. He carefully approached the entrance, heart beating hard in his chest. When he peeked out from behind a porthole, he saw no one. The ice was empty. It was only when he stepped outside onto the deck that he saw the object lying near the railing. A rock, and on its surface, written in white paint, were the words, "Tonight we take what's ours." His throat tightened. Someone had been watching. Someone knew. And now they were coming. He ushered the girls into the truck as calmly as he could manage, masking his fear behind a forced smile. As they drove away, he could not shake the feeling that the ship wasn't alone on the frozen river, that someone stood in the shadows of the forest, waiting for nightfall. And in the rearview mirror, he could have sworn he saw a figure perched near the ship's bow, unmoving as the fog swirled around them. The night that followed was one Andrew would remember for the rest of his life. Long after he and the girls had returned home, long after he'd locked every door and checked the windows twice, the unease clung to him like frost that refused to melt. Even as the girls played quietly in the living room, unaware of the full weight of what he had uncovered, Andrew kept glancing toward the darkened windows, half expecting to see a silhouette watching from the yard. Whenever a car passed on the distant road, he felt his chest tighten, but no one came. Not that night. When morning broke, he barely slept 2 hours, but the girls were already bundling themselves into coats and boots, asking when they would go back. He wanted to say never, to tell them the truth, that the ship was more dangerous than he had imagined, that the symbols carved into the trees and the warnings on painted stones weren't childish pranks, but threats rooted in a criminal history older than their entire town. But he didn't want fear to take root in them. They were too young to understand the depth of the violence that once lived on that ship, and he was too proud, or perhaps too stubborn, to let fear dictate his next steps. He had spent months drowning in grief, paralyzed by helplessness. Now he finally had a purpose, and he refused to abandon it. Still, he moved carefully. They drove to the river as if nothing had changed, but he kept checking his mirrors, waiting for a tail. The sky was overcast, thick with low clouds that pressed down on the world, as though hiding something behind their weight. When they reached the clearing, snow had fallen overnight, covering the fresh tire tracks. Only the symbol carved into the pine remained, its sharp lines hardened by the cold. Andrew tried to ignore the way the forest seemed too quiet. He helped the girls across the ice and onto the deck, forcing a steady tone into his voice as he told them to stay together and not wander far. Inside, the ship greeted them with its familiar cold breath, but something felt different, not hostile, not dangerous, simply aware, as if it, too, expected company. The girls resumed their games, reorganizing their makeshift rooms with childish pride. Andrew forced himself to join their routine, repairing broken hinges, prying loose frozen bolts, and taking measurements as though the ship were any ordinary renovation project. But all the while, his thoughts kept circling back to the hidden archive, the symbols, and the threat painted on the rock. When the girls wandered toward the dining hall, Andrew slipped back to the lower chamber. The air was colder now, as though the ship's steel bones held the memory of whatever had been sealed here decades ago. He knelt in front of the open container, scanning its contents more thoroughly. Behind the folders and tapes lay several smaller boxes, each marked with years: 1984, 1986, 1991. Underneath them, wrapped carefully in canvas, was something heavier. He lifted it gently, the weight familiar in a way that made his stomach twist. When he unwrapped it, he found a thick metal book-shaped case, locked with a clasp and engraved with the Lucarelli emblem. He let out a slow breath. This wasn't just evidence. It was a ledger, the kind the Mafia used to keep only in whispers and blood. Carefully, he set it aside. There would be time to deal with it later, once he found a safe place for the girls. For now, he needed to focus on survival, on finishing the ship enough to move into temporarily, or at least until he figured out who had found them. When he climbed the ladder, a sharp anxiety prickled at his spine. The hallway above was quiet, too quiet. He rounded the corner quickly, expecting the worst. But there were only the girls, still playing. Haley glanced at him and asked why he looked pale. He lied and said it was the cold. A few hours later, the sun began to fade, and Andrew gathered the girls to head home. He was anxious to leave before the shadows deepened, and whatever had been carved into that pine felt closer. Once they were in the truck, he took one last look at the ship. For a brief moment, he thought he saw movement on the upper deck, a silhouette leaning against the railing. But when he blinked, the figure was gone. The next day brought more snow, and with it, an unexpected turn in Andrew's resolve. He realized something. If someone planned to return for the archive, they wouldn't wait long. The records were too valuable. And the person who left the warning had come without a vehicle near the clearing, no fresh tracks beyond the ones he saw earlier. Whoever it was likely knew the forest's hidden paths. That meant they could be watching at any moment. He could not keep the girls here forever. So he made a choice. He drove them to the river again, but this time with tools, blankets, and a box of canned food. He told them they were going to fix the ship faster, make it safer, works harder. The girls, delighted, rushed inside ahead of him. Andrew followed, but not before checking the tree line twice. He began insulating the captain's quarters, using foam panels he had brought from home. The girls helped until their hands got cold, then wandered off to explore the cabins. The work distracted him, but only until Marley returned, tugging on his sleeve, saying she heard voices near the engine room. He didn't dismiss her. Not this time. He grabbed a crowbar and hurried down the corridor. The engine room was dark, untouched since the day the ship froze into the river. It smelled of oil and rust, and the silence inside was the kind that swallowed sound whole. Andrew scanned the corners with his flashlight. No one. But the door to the lower maintenance hatch, which had been shut the day before, now hung slightly ajar. He closed it quietly, forcing his breath steady, and returned to the girls with a smile he didn't feel. He needed to get them above deck, into the light. For the rest of the afternoon, he kept them close, working in the wheelhouse so he could watch the shoreline through the windows. The day ended without incident. But that evening, as they approached the clearing to leave, he stopped dead in his tracks. Someone had left tracks in the snow, not from heavy boots. Smaller, lighter, almost barefoot. 6 pairs of prints, 3 leading toward the ship, 3 leading away. He swallowed hard, heart pounding. Whatever had come there had not been human. Or it had once been human, and now was something else entirely. He bundled the girls into the truck, and as he shut the door, he felt the air shift behind him. He turned sharply. At the edge of the forest, between the pines, stood a shape so still and unnerving that Andrew couldn't breathe for several seconds. It looked like a person, but wrong somehow. too light, too thin. It tilting its head unnaturally, observing him with a patience that felt ancient. Then it turned and melted into the trees. Andrew didn't wait. He jumped into the truck, started the engine, and tore down the dirt road faster than he should have. His hands shook the entire drive home. The girl sat quietly in the back, sensing his fear without understanding it. That night, he considered calling the police. But what would he tell them? That he found a Mafia archive in a frozen ship? That something non-human watched them from the trees? They would dismiss him. Or worse, they would take everything away. So he did what he had always done. He kept going. Over the next few days, the ship became more livable. He fixed the windows in the captain's quarters, cleared debris from the stairwell, and repaired the old stove in the kitchen. The girls decorated their cabins with drawings and blankets. Despite the fear, the ship felt more like home than their actual house had in years. And strangely, the strange presence near the ship never returned. No more footprints, no more figures. The threat carved into the pine faded beneath new snowfall. But Andrew did not let his guard down. On the 5th day, he returned alone. He told the girls he had work in town and left them with a neighbor. He didn't want them anywhere near the ship if danger returned. This time, he planned to finish repairing the lower chamber and hide the ledger somewhere no intruder could reach. As he stepped through the hull, he felt the tension in the air again. A heaviness. A cold deeper than winter. He reached the lower chamber and froze. The container was open. Not how he left it. Everything inside had been disturbed. Folders scattered. Tapes unspooled. The ledger missing. His stomach dropped. Someone had been here. Someone who knew exactly what to look for. He knelt among the scattered papers, flipping through them desperately, until he found something tucked beneath the mess, a torn scrap of paper, handwritten in the same familiar paint as the warning on the rock. You took what wasn't yours. Now we take what is ours. His heart hammered. The forest had been watching. Those footprints had meant something. And now the archive, the key to everything, was in their hands. He stood in the dark, surrounded by the secrets of dead men, and understood the terrible truth. This wasn't about possession anymore. It was a war he had stumbled into by accident. And the ship, ancient and heavy, and filled with ghosts of the past, was no longer just a home he hoped to restore. It had become a battlefield. He reached for his flashlight and headed deeper into the ship, searching desperately for signs of intrusion. But the darkness swallowed everything. Footsteps echoed where they shouldn't. Shadows shifted in the corners of his vision. Something moved in the hallway behind him. He spun around, breath sharp, crowbar in hand. For a moment, he expected to see one of the men from the photographs, ghosts of killers or desperate souls. But there was nothing except the faint smell of cold air drifting in. He climbed quickly to the main deck, heart racing. The sky above was a thick blanket of gray, and the ice around the ship stretched out silently. Nothing moved, and yet he felt eyes on him, watching, waiting. He hurried across the ice, slipped once, caught his balance, and kept running until he reached the shore. Every instinct screamed that something had changed, that something had awakened now that the container had been opened. When he reached the clearing, he saw the pine tree again. The symbol carved in its bark had been altered. A fresh line had been cut through it, a slash, diagonal and deep, a warning, a marker, a promise. He drove home with shaking hands, whispering to himself that he had to protect his daughters, had to find a way out before the violence of the past returned in full. But when he arrived home, the front door was slightly open, and inside, the girls were gone. The house was silent except for the faint rustle of cold wind through the cracked doorway, and on the kitchen table lay the ledger he thought was stolen. Beside it, a new message written in the same white paint. You want them back. Bring the ship. If you liked this story, subscribe to the channel, watch the next videos, and share this one with someone who might enjoy it.